The moment everything began to unravel did not arrive with a headline or a courtroom filing, but in a far quieter, more unsettling way, when whispers started circulating through Hollywood that one of its most carefully protected marriages was cracking from the inside. And the first person to finally acknowledge it was not a tabloid reporter or a publicist, but a friend who had kept silent for decades. For nearly 20 years, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban had been presented as a rare exception in an industry built on short-lived romances, a couple who survived fame, addiction, distance, and relentless public scrutiny while continuing to speak about each other with devotion that seemed almost defiant. Their love story had been sold as proof that something pure could still exist under the blinding lights, that loyalty could endure where so many others had collapsed. Then Russell Crowe spoke, and the illusion shifted. His words did not explode outward with scandalous flair, yet they carried a quiet authority that made them impossible to ignore, because he was not an outsider guessing from headlines, but someone who had been present long before the cameras ever mattered. Long before red carpets and award shows, he had known Nicole as a driven young woman chasing opportunity in Australia, navigating ambition, rejection, and sacrifice with a resolve that few ever truly understood. When he finally broke his silence, it felt less like gossip and more like the slow opening of a door that had been locked for years, revealing a truth that had been hidden not out of shame, but out of loyalty. The shock was not simply that the marriage had ended, but that the ending carried so much quiet intention, so little spectacle, and such a decisive sense of control that it forced people to question everything they thought they had been watching. The public had seen Keith on stage, pouring his heart out, praising Nicole with emotional speeches that brought audiences to tears, while Nicole herself appeared composed, distant, almost unreadable, her expression calm even as rumors swirled. To many, that calm looked cold. To Russell, it looked like someone who had reached the end of her endurance. What made his account so unsettling was not the suggestion of betrayal alone, but the way it reframed years of public moments that had once seemed reassuring. The longer tours, the missed milestones, the increasing physical distance that had been explained away as the cost of success suddenly took on a different weight. Behind the scenes, according to those close enough to see it, the marriage had been slowly hollowed out by absence and silence, by unanswered questions and habits that no longer aligned with the promises that once held them together. The tragedy, if it could be called that, was not sudden. It was incremental, built from small fractures that accumulated until even loyalty could no longer bridge the gap. Russell's voice entered the story at the precise moment when narratives were beginning to tilt in an uncomfortable direction, casting Nicole as emotionally detached and Keith as the wounded partner left behind. That was the version he could not allow to stand, because he had witnessed a different reality, one defined not by indifference, but by patience, by someone who had already fought one battle for her marriage and understood exactly what it cost to fight another. In his telling, the heartbreak was not rooted in anger, but in exhaustion, in the realization that love alone could not repair what secrecy and distance had eroded. The atmosphere surrounding their separation felt eerie in its restraint, lacking the usual chaos of high-profile breakups, and that restraint itself became a statement. There were no public accusations, no emotional interviews, no dramatic performances of pain. Instead, there was silence, decisive and controlled, signaling that whatever had happened had crossed a boundary that could not be negotiated back into place. As the entertainment world reeled from the implications, one truth became clear almost immediately. This was not a story about a marriage that faded, but about a woman who recognized the moment when staying would cost her more than leaving. Russell Crowe's words did not seek to humiliate or sensationalize, but to contextualize, to remind people that strength does not always announce itself loudly, and that sometimes the most devastating chapters are written without spectacle. The sense of unease that followed his remarks did not come from explicit details, but from the weight of what was implied, a realization that the love so many admired had been tested beyond repair long before anyone was ready to see it, and that the calm ending was not an absence of feeling, but the final act of someone who had already grieved in private. Long before the world learned to associate her name with red carpets, prestige films, and carefully guarded privacy, Nicole Kidman was shaped by a quieter set of pressures that never truly left her, even at the height of fame. She grew up between cultures, carrying the emotional discipline of an Australian upbringing mixed with an early awareness that nothing in life was guaranteed. That sense of impermanence followed her into the entertainment industry, where success was never promised and vulnerability was often punished. From the beginning, she learned to survive by maintaining composure, by keeping her emotional core protected while presenting resilience to the outside world. Those closest to her noticed it early: the way she listened more than she spoke, the way she observed people before trusting them, and how loyalty, once given, was rarely withdrawn easily. It was during those formative years, before Hollywood had fully claimed her, that she formed one of the most enduring relationships of her life with Russell Crowe. Their bond was not built on glamour or convenience, but on shared struggle, professional rejection, and the unspoken understanding that ambition could be both fuel and burden. They were peers in an industry that demanded emotional armor, and that shared reality forged a trust that outlasted trends, marriages, and media cycles. As Nicole's career accelerated internationally, she entered a marriage that placed her personal life under an unforgiving microscope, forcing her to learn how to smile through fractures that the public would only recognize years later. When that chapter ended, the world saw collapse, but those who knew her saw something else entirely: a woman quietly recalibrating her boundaries after giving more than she should have. That experience left marks that did not fade, shaping how she approached love afterward, not with cynicism, but with caution sharpened by experience. When she later met Keith Urban, it felt, at least initially, like a different kind of story, one rooted in sheer vulnerability rather than image. Keith was open about his struggles, his flaws visible in a way that felt honest rather than curated. And for Nicole, that honesty resonated deeply. She was not drawn to perfection, but to sincerity, to the idea that love could exist alongside brokenness if both people were willing to confront it. Their early connection unfolded away from spectacle, built through small moments and private understanding, which only reinforced her belief that this relationship could withstand what others could not. Those around her saw how fiercely she committed once again, how she adjusted her career rhythms, protected their private space, and absorbed the emotional weight that came with supporting someone fighting personal demons. To the outside world, the narrative became one of triumph, love conquering addiction, stability emerging from chaos, and a marriage that symbolized endurance. But beneath that narrative lived a more complex reality, one shaped by the same discipline and self-control that had guided Nicole since her youth. She did not romanticize sacrifice, yet she accepted it as part of loving fully, believing that presence and patience could create lasting change. Russell, watching from close proximity, understood the cost of that commitment better than most, recognizing patterns that echoed earlier chapters of her life, moments when she once again chose to hold a fragile structure together rather than walk away at the first sign of strain. As years passed, the demands of their respective careers intensified, pulling them into separate orbits that tested even the strongest emotional foundations. Nicole's professional world required immersion, emotional exposure, and constant reinvention, while Keith's demanded physical absence, relentless touring, and long stretches defined by isolation rather than routine. The distance was not merely geographic, it was experiential, creating two parallel lives that intersected less frequently than they once had. Those closest to Nicole noticed subtle changes, not dramatic breakdowns, but a growing quietness, a heaviness that settled behind her eyes when conversations drifted toward logistics rather than connection. She remained composed, efficient, and professional, yet the emotional labor she carried became increasingly invisible to everyone except those who knew how to look for it. This was not a woman unaware of her circumstances, nor one blindsided by hardship, but someone acutely conscious of the fragility of what she was trying to preserve. Her past had taught her that love could disappear suddenly, but it had also taught her that leaving too soon could haunt you just as deeply. That internal conflict defined much of her private life, the constant calculation between endurance and self-preservation. Russell saw this tension clearly, recognizing that Nicole was navigating a familiar crossroads, one she had faced before under different circumstances, and he understood why she hesitated to name it out loud. For someone whose entire career depended on emotional expression, her personal pain was handled with extraordinary restraint. She had learned early that once a story becomes public, it no longer belongs to you, and she was determined not to surrender control of her narrative again. That restraint, often misinterpreted as detachment, was in reality the product of years spent learning how easily vulnerability could be weaponized. By the time cracks began forming that could no longer be ignored, Nicole was not reacting impulsively, but responding from a place shaped by decades of experience, memory, and hard-earned clarity. The foundations of the story that would later shock Hollywood were not built in a single moment, but layered slowly over time, rooted in childhood discipline, early professional bonds, past heartbreak, and an unwavering belief in loyalty that refused to dissolve quietly. What finally pushed everything into the open was not a single explosive discovery, but a sequence of moments that slowly stripped away the comfort of denial, leaving only clarity behind. By this point, the distance that had once been explained as a temporary sacrifice for career had begun to feel permanent, and the emotional rhythm of the marriage no longer moved in sync. From the outside, nothing appeared dramatically wrong, yet those closest to Nicole could sense a shift, a subtle withdrawal that revealed itself in small, telling details rather than public conflict. Conversations became shorter, updates from the road less specific, and the sense of shared daily life that once grounded their relationship started to erode. Touring had always been demanding, but now it carried a different weight, not just separation, but emotional absence. Nicole noticed patterns long before she acknowledged them. The way certain explanations no longer aligned, the way reassurances felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. She did not confront immediately, because she had learned that intuition needs confirmation before it becomes accusation. Instead, she watched, listened, and quietly measured inconsistencies, all while maintaining the public image of stability expected of her. It was during this period that her performances took on a sharper edge, scenes of grief and betrayal resonating with an authenticity that unsettled even seasoned colleagues. Those on set observed how her emotional intensity lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling, as if the line between character and personal life had thinned. Meanwhile, Keith's public declarations of devotion grew louder, more emphatic, framed as gratitude and admiration, but increasingly misaligned with what Nicole was experiencing privately. To some, these gestures reinforced the idea of a devoted husband. To others, including Russell Crowe, they felt performative, almost compensatory, as though something unseen required constant reinforcement. Russell had witnessed enough relationships unravel to recognize this pattern, where affirmation becomes spectacle rather than intimacy, and he sensed that the marriage was entering a dangerous phase where appearances mattered more than truth. The tension reached a breaking point through a series of discoveries that could no longer be rationalized away. Nicole began to notice guarded behavior that felt foreign to a relationship built on openness, small acts of secrecy that carried disproportionate significance because of their contrast with the trust she believed they shared. There were explanations that arrived too late, stories that changed slightly when repeated, and emotional reactions that seemed defensive rather than reassuring. She did not rush to judgment, but each fragment added weight to an internal reckoning she could no longer postpone. When she finally found messages that confirmed her fears, the realization did not come with shock so much as a devastating sense of recognition. This was not the first time doubt had crossed her mind, but it was the first time doubt had transformed into evidence. The timing made it even more unbearable. She was already emotionally exhausted, immersed in demanding work that required vulnerability, while her personal life demanded restraint. The contrast was brutal, forcing her to compartmentalize pain in order to function, a skill she had perfected but never wanted to use this way again. In the quiet aftermath of that discovery, she turned not to public outrage or confrontation, but to Russell, the one person who had seen every version of her life without needing explanation. To him, she did not dramatize or exaggerate. She spoke plainly, laying out what she had seen, what no longer made sense, and what she feared acknowledging. Russell understood immediately that this was not about suspicion alone, but about broken trust that had been tested too many times. He also understood why she hesitated to act impulsively, because walking away would not just end a marriage, it would dismantle an identity she had fought to build around loyalty and perseverance. The confrontation that followed was not theatrical. It unfolded in the stark intimacy of private space, fueled not by raised voices, but by accumulated disappointment. Nicole presented what she knew calmly, almost clinically, as though clarity itself had become her shield. There were no ultimatums delivered in anger, only boundaries articulated with precision. She made it clear that survival of the marriage would require transparency and tangible change, not promises shaped for reassurance. For a brief moment, hope flickered, sustained by the familiar belief that honesty could still restore what distance had damaged. That hope was fragile, contingent on action rather than words, and both of them understood the stakes. Publicly, signs of reconciliation appeared convincing enough to reassure fans. Yet privately, the underlying issues resurfaced with unsettling familiarity. Old habits returned, guardedness crept back in, an emotional divide widened rather than closed. This repetition was what ultimately broke something irrevocably inside Nicole. It was no longer the betrayal itself that defined the moment, but the realization that the commitment she had demanded could not be sustained. She recognized that continuing would mean accepting a cycle she had already endured, sacrificing her sense of self to preserve an image that no longer reflected reality. Russell watched as she reached this conclusion, noting the absence of drama in her decision, the way resolve replaced confusion once the truth settled fully. When she chose to end the marriage, it was done quietly and decisively, without public spectacle or attempts to control the narrative through emotion. The speed with which the separation followed reflected not impulsiveness, but preparation, as though she had already processed the grief long before the world became aware of it. Legal arrangements were handled with efficiency, revealing where leverage truly lay and underscoring that this was not a mutual fading, but a line drawn after trust was exhausted. For Keith, the aftermath carried visible weight, his silence louder than any statement, his withdrawal signaling consequences he could not escape. For Nicole, the response was measured, almost serene, a composure that many misread as detachment, but was in fact the final stage of a long internal battle. Russell's eventual decision to speak emerged from this context, not as an attempt to expose, but to correct a narrative forming without nuance. He understood how easily restraint could be misinterpreted as indifference, and how quickly endurance could be reframed as coldness. By sharing what he had witnessed, he reframed the story from one of abandonment to one of self-preservation. The unraveling of the marriage, when viewed in full, was not sudden or impulsive, but the inevitable outcome of unresolved distance, broken promises, and a woman finally choosing to stop negotiating with her own pain. It was a moment shaped not by scandal, but by clarity, the kind that arrives only after every other option has been exhausted. The consequences of that decision rippled outward in ways that were both visible and deeply hidden, reshaping not only two public lives, but an entire narrative that had once symbolized endurance. In the immediate aftermath, the silence was striking. There were no competing statements, no emotional appeals, no attempts to sway public sympathy. That absence of noise became the loudest signal of all. Those close to Nicole noticed how swiftly she reorganized her life around stability rather than repair, prioritizing routine, work, and the protection of her private world with a focus that felt almost surgical. What surprised many was not that she was hurting, but how deliberately she refused to let that hurt dictate her behavior. She had already mourned the relationship in private, long before the legal steps made anything official, and by the time the public became aware, she had reached a stage of quiet acceptance. The emotional cost, however, did not vanish simply because it was managed well. Friends described a period of profound withdrawal, not from people, but from expectation, as if she was reclaiming space that had been slowly consumed by compromise. On set, her professionalism remained unchanged, yet her performances carried a gravity that audiences could feel without understanding its source. Scenes of loss, restraint, and resolve resonated differently, as though lived experience had deepened her ability to inhabit those emotions without exaggeration. Industry peers remarked on a new stillness about her, a sense of composure that was neither defensive nor performative, but rooted in clarity. Meanwhile, the fallout for Keith manifested in ways that contrasted sharply with the public image he had maintained for years. His absence from events, canceled appearances, and reluctance to engage with media suggested a reckoning that could not be managed through charm or explanation. Those around him described frustration layered with regret, a recognition that silence was now a necessity rather than a choice. The dynamic had shifted, and with it, the balance of power that so often defines how these stories unfold. The legal arrangements that followed underscored that shift with stark efficiency. Custody terms and financial decisions were finalized without prolonged dispute, revealing how thoroughly the matter had already been settled emotionally. There was no prolonged negotiation because the outcome had been determined the moment trust collapsed beyond recovery. For Nicole, this was not about punishment or revenge, but about containment, ensuring that the end of the marriage did not metastasize into ongoing conflict that would touch her children or her sense of peace. That restraint required discipline, the same discipline that had guided her through earlier chapters of her life, and it carried its own quiet toll. The public response oscillated between confusion and admiration, as fans struggled to reconcile the image they had been given with the reality that emerged. Some interpreted her composure as emotional distance, others as strength, but few grasped how much effort it takes to remain silent when the world expects explanation. Russell watched this reaction unfold with a familiar sense of frustration, having seen how easily narratives simplify complex emotional realities into digestible archetypes. He recognized that Nicole's refusal to participate in the spectacle was itself an act of self-preservation, a boundary drawn not just against her former marriage, but against an industry that thrives on access. The long-term consequences extended beyond perception into legacy. A marriage once held up as proof that love could survive anything now stood as an example of something else entirely, that perseverance has limits, and that leaving can be as intentional and courageous as staying. For Nicole, the end marked a recalibration rather than a collapse. She did not retreat from her career or her public responsibilities, but she redefined how much of herself she was willing to give away. That recalibration was subtle, reflected in choices rather than statements, in the projects she selected, the way she spoke, and the boundaries she maintained. Those who knew her well observed a renewed sense of agency, not the brittle control of someone afraid to be hurt again, but the grounded assurance of someone who understands her own threshold. The impact on those around her was equally significant. Friends and collaborators adjusted their expectations, recognizing that her silence was not an invitation to speculate, but a signal to respect limits that had been earned through loss. In contrast, Keith's world narrowed temporarily, his usual openness replaced by caution, as though the consequences of his actions had finally demanded attention without distraction. This divergence in their post-marriage trajectories highlighted the asymmetry of how each processed the aftermath. One moved forward through containment and focus, the other through retreat and reflection. Russell's role in this phase remained peripheral yet consequential. He did not insert himself into the narrative immediately, understanding that timing matters as much as truth. He watched as assumptions solidified, as simplified explanations began to circulate, and as Nicole absorbed the weight of misinterpretation without response. The effect of that misalignment lingered, creating a tension that would eventually prompt him to act, not to reveal new wounds, but to contextualize existing ones. The real consequence of the unraveling was not the end of a relationship, but the exposure of how endurance is often misread when it finally ends. In choosing silence, Nicole accepted that misunderstanding was the price of dignity, a cost she was willing to pay to preserve what mattered most. The aftermath, stripped of spectacle, revealed a different kind of resilience, one that does not announce itself loudly, but reshapes life through deliberate, disciplined choice. What remained hidden from public view during this period were the quieter moments that never reached headlines, the private reckonings that unfolded away from cameras and court documents, where the true weight of the separation was carried. In the months following the split, Nicole's daily life was marked by routines that appeared ordinary on the surface, but carried deep emotional intention beneath them. She became meticulous about time, carving out mornings that belonged solely to her children, evenings that were deliberately unfilled, and spaces where silence was not something to escape, but something to inhabit. Friends noticed how she began to choose stillness over distraction, declining invitations not out of withdrawal, but out of discernment. These were not the actions of someone unraveling, but of someone rebuilding with precision. In private conversations, she spoke less about betrayal and more about boundaries, about recognizing the difference between loving someone and losing oneself in the process. That distinction had not come easily. It had been shaped by years of patience, by nights spent waiting for reassurance that arrived too late, and by the slow erosion of trust that no single apology could restore. Those closest to her recalled moments when she questioned herself quietly, not doubting her decision, but mourning the version of the future she had once believed in. There was grief, but it was not chaotic. It moved in waves, predictable yet heavy, surfacing during small domestic moments rather than public milestones. A song on the radio, an empty chair at the dinner table, a memory triggered by habit rather than nostalgia. In those moments, she allowed herself to feel without spectacle, understanding that healing did not require an audience. Russell was one of the few people she spoke to during those nights when composure slipped, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the cost of her restraint. To him, she admitted how exhausting it had been to carry hope long after doubt had taken root, how difficult it was to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she was becoming. He listened without offering solutions, aware that what she needed was not advice, but validation that her exhaustion was justified. The loyalty he showed did not involve public defense at first, but presence, a steady acknowledgement that her silence was not weakness but choice. Behind the scenes, other fragments of the story surfaced quietly, not as scandal, but as context. People who had worked alongside the couple began to recognize patterns they had once dismissed: the canceled plans, the last-minute schedule changes, the emotional labor Nicole absorbed to keep their shared life intact. None of these details alone told a complete story, but together they painted a picture of imbalance that had been normalized for too long. There were moments when she questioned whether staying silent allowed the wrong narrative to grow unchecked, but each time she returned to the same conclusion: that truth spoken too early becomes noise, and noise benefits no one. She was protecting not just herself, but her children, who deserved stability rather than spectacle. In contrast, Keith's private struggles unfolded differently, shaped by regret and a dawning awareness of consequence. Those close to him described a man confronting the aftermath of choices he could no longer reframe or soften. His usual confidence gave way to introspection, and while there was no public confession, there was an undeniable shift in demeanor. Silence, once strategic, became necessary. The absence of retaliation or blame from Nicole left little room for deflection, forcing a reckoning that words could not dilute. This imbalance in response became one of the most telling aspects of the story, not because one suffered more than the other, but because each had reached a different point in the emotional timeline long before the public ever caught up. Nicole had done her grieving early, privately, in fragments spread across years of compromise. By the time the marriage ended, she was already standing on the far side of loss, while Keith was only beginning to understand its depth. The quiet support network around Nicole played a crucial role during this phase, not by shielding her from reality, but by reinforcing her sense of agency. They respected her refusal to explain herself publicly, recognizing that dignity often requires withholding rather than disclosure. There were no tell-all conversations, no strategic leaks, no subtle corrections offered to friendly journalists. That restraint was deliberate, rooted in a belief that some truths gain power through time rather than repetition. Russell observed this discipline with admiration, understanding that in an industry built on narrative control, choosing not to speak can be the most radical act. As months passed, the absence of drama began to recalibrate perception on its own. Audiences noticed how Nicole carried herself, how she returned to work with focus rather than defiance, how her performances reflected depth without bitterness. Slowly, the narrative shifted, not because it was corrected directly, but because it no longer aligned with the woman people were watching. The quiet stories, once hidden, began to resonate through implication rather than exposure. They revealed a pattern of strength that did not rely on vindication, a commitment to self-respect that asked for no validation. These unseen chapters, lived far from headlines, became the true foundation of her transformation, not as someone defined by loss, but as someone who chose clarity over comfort, even when the cost was profound. In that silence, the most important truths took shape, not shouted, not defended, but simply lived. As time created distance from the collapse of the marriage, what remained was not scandal, but meaning, a quieter reckoning that reshaped how the story was understood. For Nicole, the end did not erase the years that came before it, nor did it reduce her life to a single rupture. Instead, it reframed everything that had preceded it, revealing patterns of endurance that had long been mistaken for ease. Her legacy, viewed through this lens, was never about perfection or romantic triumph, but about the discipline required to keep choosing integrity when compromise becomes self-erasure. Those who had followed her career closely began to recognize that this was not a departure from who she had always been, but a return to her core, the same resolve that carried her through early uncertainty, public heartbreak, and relentless scrutiny without surrendering her sense of self. The marriage, once held up as proof of emotional victory, became part of a larger narrative about limits, about the point at which love demands too much and courage requires release rather than persistence. This shift in understanding did not come from statements or interviews, but from observation, from watching how she moved forward without spectacle, how she refused to let bitterness define her next chapter. In doing so, she offered a different model of strength, one that does not seek vindication, but clarity. Her work reflected this evolution subtly, yet unmistakably. Performances carried restraint rather than rage, depth rather than dramatization, as though she had learned that pain does not need amplification to be felt. Audiences responded to this shift instinctively, sensing an authenticity that could not be manufactured. It was the byproduct of lived experience, of lessons absorbed slowly and carried quietly. For many, this became the most compelling aspect of her story, not that she had been hurt, but that she refused to let that hurt become her identity. The absence of public grievance allowed her legacy to remain intact, not frozen in an idealized past, but dynamic, adaptive, and resilient. The broader lesson embedded in this chapter extended beyond celebrity, resonating with anyone who has ever mistaken endurance for obligation. Her choice illuminated a truth that is often uncomfortable to confront, that perseverance is not inherently virtuous when it costs one's sense of self, and that leaving can be an act of fidelity to one's values rather than a failure to uphold them. This reframing challenged cultural expectations, particularly for women, where patience and forgiveness are frequently praised without equal regard for personal cost. Nicole's silence became instructive, demonstrating that dignity does not require explanation, and that boundaries, once crossed repeatedly, demand consequence rather than negotiation. The role Russell played in this phase of the story underscored that lesson rather than overshadowing it. His loyalty was not performative, not designed to elevate his own voice, but to protect the truth from distortion when it mattered most. By speaking selectively and sparingly, he reinforced the idea that support does not always mean amplification. Sometimes it means restraint. His intervention did not redefine her narrative. It simply prevented it from being mischaracterized beyond recognition. Together, their actions highlighted a different kind of alliance, one rooted not in public alignment, but in mutual respect for privacy and timing. As the years moved forward, the initial shock faded, replaced by a deeper appreciation for the composure that had once been misread. The marriage that ended no longer defined the woman who emerged from it. Instead, it became one chapter among many, significant not for its collapse, but for what it revealed about strength, self-respect, and the courage to end what no longer aligns with one's truth. In an industry that thrives on spectacle, this refusal to perform pain became part of her enduring impact. She demonstrated that healing does not need a narrative arc visible to others, that growth can occur quietly, without apology or explanation. Her legacy, shaped by both triumph and loss, now rests on something more durable than romantic idealism. It rests on the knowledge that survival is not merely about staying, but about knowing when to step away with one's values intact. In that sense, the story transcends celebrity and becomes something universal, a reminder that the most meaningful transformations often happen without witnesses, guided by an internal compass rather than public approval. What remains is not a cautionary tale, but a testament to self-awareness, to the power of choosing peace over performance, and to the kind of strength that does not announce itself, but endures long after the noise has faded. By the time the story reached its quiet conclusion, there was no dramatic finale to mark the end of the marriage, only a sense of closure that felt deliberate rather than tragic. The years of speculation, whispered theories, and projected fantasies dissolve in the face of something far less sensational and far more revealing: a woman choosing peace over persistence and dignity over defense. What lingered was not the image of a relationship falling apart, but the portrait of someone who understood that survival does not always look like endurance. Nicole's decision to walk away did not erase the love that once existed, nor did it diminish the sacrifices she had made along the way. Instead, it clarified them, transforming what could have been framed as loss into an assertion of self-respect. She did not attempt to control the narrative, yet over time, the narrative aligned with her actions rather than her silence. People began to notice how little she needed to say for the truth to settle. There were no coded messages, no public reckonings, no attempts to win sympathy. The absence of performance became its own statement, one that resonated more deeply than any confession could. For audiences accustomed to emotional spectacle, this restraint felt unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, but that discomfort was precisely what gave the ending its weight. It forced a reevaluation of what strength actually looks like when stripped of drama. The legacy that emerged from this chapter was not defined by heartbreak, but by clarity. Nicole did not position herself as a victim. nor did she vilify the past. She acknowledged reality through action, through boundaries upheld without explanation, through a future shaped by intention rather than reaction. Her continued focus on her work, her children, and her inner equilibrium reinforced a message that required no translation, that healing does not demand validation, and that closure does not require consensus. The world watched as she carried herself forward with a calm that no longer needed interpretation. Meanwhile, the silence surrounding the end of the marriage spoke volumes about accountability. There was no public counter-narrative, no attempt to reframe the story in more favorable terms. That quiet acceptance underscored where the truth lay more effectively than any rebuttal could have. Russell's role in the final arc of this story remained consistent with everything that came before it. He did not linger in the spotlight, nor did he continue to elaborate once his point had been made. His intervention achieved its purpose, not by escalating the conversation, but by grounding it. He stepped back once balance was restored, allowing the story to conclude without further intrusion. In doing so, he modeled a rare form of loyalty, one that prioritizes timing, proportion, and respect over visibility. The closing impression left behind was not one of devastation, but of resolution. This was not a fairy tale undone, but a reality accepted with composure. It reframed the entire journey, reminding viewers that love stories do not lose their meaning simply because they end. Sometimes their meaning is revealed only in the ending, in a way the final chapter is written without bitterness or regret. Nicole's story resonated precisely because it resisted the urge to teach a lesson overtly. Instead, it offered something more subtle, an example of how to leave with grace, how to choose oneself without spectacle, and how to allow truth to emerge organically. In an era obsessed with confession and exposure, her restraint became radical. She demonstrated that not every wound needs to be displayed to be acknowledged, and that silence, when chosen intentionally, can be a form of power rather than avoidance. The narrative that once seemed wild settled into something far more enduring, a reflection on self-awareness, on the limits of sacrifice, and on the courage it takes to end what no longer aligns with who you are. As the noise faded, what remained was a quiet clarity that needed no defense. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to share your thoughts. Reflect on what strength means in moments of ending, and consider how often the most powerful choices are made without applause. Do you want me to continue or make any adjustments?